Hi, this is Dan, First Person Looter, and this is my reaction to the third episode of HBO's television show adaptation of The Last of Us video game of the same title. There better be giraffes. Well, they always said the show would deviate from the game, and while we saw that happen throughout the previous two episodes, this was the episode where they absolutely deviated from the show the most. And before I get into my criticisms, allow me to say that I am all for them changing the story for the better being the key term. Apparently the showrunners thought it was better, and it's their work. Better is pretty subjective, so all I can say is that I disagreed with the showrunners on these changes being better than the original story. I also feel I should say, based on one response to my tweets, I am not against gay characters. I played through and loved both The Last of Us games, and I spent many months leading up to Part 2's release defending the game having a butch or muscular, or some said unfeminine, female antagonist. They didn't like having a trans character, and they didn't like that the game went into Ellie's same-sex relationships. I defended all of that. I still defend it. I had no problem with the subtlety in which they told us Bill was gay in the first game. I've said it in other reaction videos that I have no problem with this. We have gay and trans family members and neighbors who we love just as much as anyone else. We support LGBTQ groups. We vote for politicians who fight for LGBTQ people. Hell, I still only wear Keel's original musk because I learned about this from a Queer Eye from the Straight Guy episode on NBC, the original, not the Netflix show. Smells so good. Thank you guys. So let me repeat that nothing about my negative feedback is because I have any ill will towards gay people. Now, I did not like this episode. Okay, but let me start off with the good. I loved the look of the episode, I loved Frank's performance, and I loved the transition to the flashback. And that was about it. I'll go scene by scene again. First off, no cold open. I really like those informative cold openings. First with the 1970s talk show and then Jakarta. This episode just didn't bother. But the first scene in the wilderness, I thought was colored a little too blue. I know it's dawn, and I'm sure they really want to emphasize that they're out of the city in a new environment, so the colors need to look different than the sickly yellow that covered most of Boston and the vibrant oranges in Texas. But it was pushed so blue, I thought that someone copied and pasted duplicates of every LUT and color node in Resolve, or however they colored the show, just totally doubling the amount of blue that was needed to sell it. Still, the shots and the sounds of the world were nice. I still think this version of Ellie is too standoffish and oddly mean and a bit rude. When she badgers Joel about his scar, I mean, really? I get she's young, but she's in a whole new world outside of the QZ. I know she's experienced some wild things, as the Left Behind DLC shows, but we don't know how much this Ellie went through before, so right now it just seems like she's far too comfortable to mess with people while they're walking around a dangerous world that she's never seen before, but has already had a clicker almost kill her, and she watched Tess blow herself up in the building. I feel like Ellie should be far more traumatized and timid at this point, and I can still hear a bit of her British accent doing its best to sound American. With all of the walk and talks in the woods and country roads, I began to wonder if we're now in the Walking Dead style part of the show where everything will take place in the middle of nowhere. Much cheaper to shoot that way, but I was told each of these episodes were more expensive than each of the Game of Thrones episodes, so I was kind of into the rest stop scene where they looked for hidden supplies. I'm not sure why Joel all of a sudden had such a hard time finding the hidden stash. That whole thing reeked of the writer's room brainstorming how they can let Ellie go off on her own for a while. So it didn't really work for me. But the basement scene was pretty unnerving. I was admittedly a little shocked at how she showed almost no fear going up to the infected and cutting its eye. That alone was creepy because why was she doing that? I also assumed this was going to be Frank. I was wrong, of course. Aside from Ellie badgering Joel about his scar, I did like the Q&A portion where Bella asked about the history of the virus. At this point, I think all viewers kind of understood what happened, at least enough to go with the story, but it was nice to hear how Joel sums it up. It was kind of cool seeing the crashed airplane, as that was the first promo shot I ever saw, but oddly, the plane looked incredibly CGI and not actually there in the show, whereas in the promo shot, I thought they really did have an actual physical crashed plane set piece. So I'm not sure now which was the right one. I really like the slow dolly into the skeletons and their last strips of clothing, because while I did at first wonder why were we zooming onto this fabric, like we're supposed to recognize this already, it was cool to see right away what was actually happening. And I did like how we seamlessly moved from those two anonymous skeletons to Bill, and before you even realize it, we've been watching 10 minutes of a brand new character, and I did temporarily forget that this was even a flashback that started with Joel's story. The first problem for me, however, is that while I was excited to see how Nick Offerman would portray Bill and thought he'd do a great job based on the teaser, I was a little let down. I'm not sure if it was his performance entirely or the fact that, once again, I couldn't separate a character from the other roles I know that the actor has been in. Offerman, at the moment, just works for me as a comedic character. Parks and Recreation is one of my favorite shows, and Ron Swanson is one of my favorite characters. I couldn't really take him seriously as Bill. I thought it would work since he's good with his hands and building things, both as his Ron character as well as how he is in other media and I think in real life, but it wasn't enough to sell it for me. Also, I guess, is HBO just trolling the "Don't Tread on Me" Republican fascists? Because Offerman has that "Don't Tread on Me" flag, but he's gay, which I think most "Don't Tread on Me" types would probably be. Maybe I don't know the "Don't Tread on Me" crowd as well as I thought, but I thought they were all straight, white Christian lunatics. Regardless, the mishmash failed for me. He also looks like he's in the wrong neighborhood. It looks like he's in Martha's Vineyard or someplace where old hippies who mean well, but really they still only spend their money on themselves to have the perfect little white picket fence go to live. This guy, Bill, looks like he would live in the woods or the mountains or have a yard filled with old broken down cars, which, okay, I guess he kind of does have in the end. But again, this is all to say that nothing about this felt authentic. Offerman doesn't look like he is Bill. The "Don't Tread on Me" flag doesn't look like it would go with a gay character, and Bill doesn't look like he'd live in that sort of town. We get a Last Man on Earth type montage with one guy going around and taking everything from everywhere. I like this, but probably because I loved Last Man on Earth. I hated the one and only infected character outside of the rest stop. I hated how he stood, how he moved. The prosthetics looked like they only partially worked on making it look like it was growing out of him. It was like this was a last-minute addition because they realized they needed at least one more infected in the episode. Maybe it was a reshoot. The Australian actor playing Frank, kudos to him. I did not know he was Australian. The voice was perfect. I loved it. I loved his performance, even though I didn't think his character deserved an entire episode. The actor was fantastic with the material he was given. And then for the next 14 or 15 minutes, the show just completely falls into a love story between these two. Yes, I accept Bill was gay in the game, despite Bill only saying Frank was his partner. We can assume he didn't mean business partner. And I'm happy for the show to go into that backstory a bit, but I did not need an entire episode, especially when you get them without the main character for 15 full minutes before we see Joel, again, only briefly, and then another 20 minutes of just Bill and Frank. And at no point does Bill talk with Joel about the important things they discuss in the game. There's no interaction with Ellie, no major infected character like the bloater, who may show up in another episode, but still, I'm glad Bill was able to at least help Joel and Ellie post-mortem, but it wasn't as impactful for me as it was in the game. But even if we leave out the game comparisons, I just didn't think the show needed to spend 35 minutes total on just Frank and Bill, especially Frank, who adds nothing of value to the main character's story. The only thing I can think, however, is that each episode is going to introduce us to and then kill off a character along Joel and Ellie's life journeys. In episode 1, we're introduced to Sarah, and then she dies in the same episode. In episode 2, we really start to get our introductions to Tess, and then she dies in that episode. And now here in episode 3, we're introduced to Bill and Frank, and they both die in the same episode. Who wants to place bets that we meet a character in episode 4 who dies in the same episode? By the way, I assumed in my episode 2 review that they'd have to bring Tess back in a flashback or something, and that's what they did. Nailed it. Oh, and the raiders at the fire fence, what was that about? At least from the editing, it felt like they just kept walking into the fire. It seems like someone new was always going up in flames. Just get away from it. I also can't accept, no matter how good with his hands he is, and no matter the amount of time that he had, he could not put up such a powerful fence around an entire community. Absolutely not. Why did I talk about giraffes at the beginning? Because they used the giraffe theme music from the game over top of the scene in this episode when they are walking to their deaths. Once again, the TV show is using the video game's music in different scenes. Interesting. Anyway, this episode was a huge letdown. I sometimes wonder if maybe media uses gay characters to shield themselves from criticism. Like, as long as they have gay characters, if anyone says they don't like the show for any reason, the show can just say, oh, it must be because you hate gay people. Like the way, ironically, incels will say the only reason a woman won't sleep with them is because they're lesbian. So now I'm not as excited for future episodes. I don't want this to be a sappy love drama show that takes place in an apocalypse and occasionally how to live in it. I want this to be a post-infected apocalypse show that deals with love and occasionally shows you how to deal with that. There are sappy shows and movies that I love, and that's what we were told they would be from the beginning, but that's not how I felt this show was advertised. Anyway, we'll see what they do next.